Her words didn't sting, they echoed. Dad never needed you, neither do I. I read that line again. The email was short, cold, almost rehearsed. 2 decades of work erased in 5 sentences. The subject line just said, termination, effective. Immediately, I sat still for a moment. The cursor blinked like a warning light on a dashboard. I looked around my office. No, her office now. The walls were still lined with framed contracts I had helped negotiate, team photos from projects I had led, handwritten notes from her father, back when this company was just a garage and a blueprint. Now it was hers. And apparently, I wasn't. Part of the future. I stood up. My knees cracked, but not from age, from hours spent reviewing site reports, not lounging in boardrooms. The air smelled like old carpet and ink. It was quiet. Everyone had gone home for the long weekend. No farewell, party, no handshake. Just 5 sentences and silence. I didn't pack anything. I just opened the drawer, took out my keycard, and walked down the hall to her corner glass office. She was still there, standing by the window, arms crossed, pretending to scroll through something on her phone. Her reflection in the glass didn't blink. I placed the card on her desk. I didn't say a word, but I smiled, not out of bitterness, out of clarity. 3 seconds of eye contact, then I turned and left. She never saw the list of contracts I had pulled from the archives that morning, never noticed the printed email still sitting on my desk, the one where she'd authorized a vendor change that violated 6 client clauses. Never realized I had already spoken to 2 of those clients. Discreetly, respectfully. I wasn't angry. Anger doesn't get you anywhere in a storm. Precision does. The elevator was slow as usual. A faint hum above. I watched the floor number. Drop. 8, 7, 6. My hands were steady. My mind wasn't racing. Everything felt still. By the time I reached the lobby, I knew what I had to do. Not out of revenge, but because some lessons can't be taught with warnings. Only consequences. That company ran on trust, not branding. On process and not charisma. And Claire, for all her ambition, never noticed how much of the scaffolding was me. She would. I stepped out into the street. The sun was still up, sharp, and low on the horizon. It caught the edge of the glass tower like a blade. I kept walking. The world didn't pause, and neither did I. I'd spent 22 years making sure her father never had to look over his shoulder. Now I wasn't behind them anymore. I was watching from a very different angle, and the moment she fired me, she stepped into a role she didn't understand and triggered a mechanism I had designed for protection, not punishment. There were 3 names she didn't recognize in her inherited contact list, but those men knew mine, and they had clauses, signatures, conditions tied to my continued involvement. She thought she'd cut me loose. She'd only pulled her own foundation. This wasn't a moment of revenge. It was a hand releasing the last thread of something I had held together for far too long. She thought silence meant weakness, but silence was just the sound of strategy. I first met Martin Blake, Claire's father, when I was 36. I had just left a mid-level management job that paid well but meant nothing. Martin found me through a mutual acquaintance, someone who told him, "If you want someone who won't just clock in, but will actually hold the weight with you, call Richard." He called. We met at a half-finished job site. He was pacing across concrete with rolled-up blueprints under his arm. Didn't shake my hand, just handed me a coffee and asked, "You good with problems no one else wants to touch?" That was our contract. No titles, no corner offices, just problems and solutions. He built the company, but I made it breathe. Legal structures, supplier networks, HR systems, training programs. While he pitched and pushed, I stabilized and executed. I never asked for credit, never wanted it. Claire was a teenager back then. Sharp, observant, always testing the edge of every rule. I remember her walking through the office one day and whispering to a new intern, "My dad owns this place. He doesn't need advice." I let it slide. She was a kid. Years passed. The company grew. We went from 3 contracts a year to national recognition. I watched Claire go through college, internships, brief stints at marketing firms. Her father beamed with pride every time she visited. He always said, "One day she'll run this, and you, Richard, will make sure she doesn't fall." I nodded, but deep down I wasn't so sure. She was brilliant, yes, but reckless. Where her father asked questions, she gave answers. Where he paused, she jumped. When Martin had a stroke at 68, the plan accelerated. The board trusted me. Investors leaned on me. But the succession was already inked. Claire was next. In the first year of her leadership, I did everything to support her. Weekly briefings, strategic guidance, gentle reminders of the regulatory landmines we'd spent years avoiding. She smiled politely, nodded, then did things her way. Slowly, I noticed the walls shift. Meetings I was once invited to began without me. Vendors I had handpicked were replaced by agile alternatives. Documents began to change without my initials. At the bottom, I wasn't blindsided. I observed. One afternoon, I walked past the executive conference room and heard her laughing with another manager. He's a relic. My dad just liked having someone he could trust with the boring stuff. That was when I started preparing, not emotionally, but logistically. I copied files, printed the contracts I had negotiated, took home backup drives, with archived communications, not because I expected betrayal, but because I had seen this story play out in others, and always promised myself, not me, not quietly. She brought in a COO from outside, young, loud, dressed like a startup ad. He called me rich once in a meeting, then smiled as if it was charming. I didn't correct him, I just noted the pattern. I moved documents into physical folders, changed passwords, not out of paranoia, just precision. The final crack came. During a quarterly review, Claire stood in front of the board and presented a new direction, one that dismantled the partnership models I had spent a decade shaping. She didn't mention me once, not even in the Q&A. After the meeting, she walked past me in the hallway. "You look tired, Richard. Maybe it's time you took a real break." I smiled, said nothing. But that night, I opened a private folder labeled Claire's Risks, 2023. Inside were copies of every contract with client dependencies tied to my involvement. I didn't forge a single line. I didn't alter a date. I just preserved the truth. I still hoped it wouldn't come to that. But by then, I was no longer part of her plan, just a reminder she hadn't fully erased yet. There's a unique kind of silence that only lives in long corridors at night, when the fluorescent lights flicker, and every click of your shoes feels like a countdown. That's when I began to detach. Not emotionally, that part had already happened, but practically, deliberately, one file at a time. I opened a new checking account separate from the one linked to my company payroll, redirected my expense reimbursements there. I wasn't hiding anything. I was insulating. I started arriving, earlier than everyone, not to impress anyone but to access the network alone. No distractions, just me and the company's back-end systems. I copied project maps, took screenshots of budget forecasts that showed gaps no one else had flagged. Some were oversights, others, I wasn't so sure. I scheduled calls late at night with two of our oldest clients. Didn't say much, just asked if they'd reviewed the new proposals Claire's team had sent. The tone on the other end told me what I needed to know. We were surprised not to see your name on it, Richard. That told me everything. These weren't clients, they were relationships. Relationships. Claire thought she inherited with a job title. That same week, I found the old leather folder Martin had given me years ago, tucked behind a file cabinet no one used anymore. Inside were handwritten notes, contingency strategies, client preferences, his private blueprint for how the company ran. He trusted me with that. Claire didn't even know it existed. I read every line. And with each word, the gap between how things were built and how they were being run grew wider. Not chaotic, not dangerous, but careless. Pride without precision. I backed up everything, even the things I didn't think I'd need. I started, taking the long route home, parking one street over, watching the office from a distance some nights. Not because I feared sabotage, but because I wanted to understand the rhythm of the place without me in it. How fast would it forget? On Friday, I stayed late. Everyone was gone. The building echoed differently when it was empty, as if it knew something was being dismantled from within. I sat at my desk, printed a document I had drafted years ago, a personal audit checklist. It wasn't official policy, just something I made for myself, to ensure nothing slipped. I reviewed it line by line, highlighted the ones Claire's team had begun to ignore. That night I found a voicemail from her on my office phone. It was short, dismissive. "We'll be reviewing leadership structures next week. If you've got recommendations, email them. Otherwise, eat a rest." I played it twice, then deleted it. I cleared my personal drawer, left the mug Martin had given me with the inscription, "Silent strength is still strength." That one stayed. The last thing I did before shutting off the lights was write down 3 names on a sticky note, the clients I'd supported from the company's earliest days. I folded it and slipped it into my wallet. Not a plan, a reminder that my value wasn't in my title. It was in trust, built one quiet year at a time. Claire thought I was standing still, but I was watching the structure sway, and in buildings, sway always comes before collapse. The morning after I handed over my keycard, I woke up before sunrise. Old habits don't retire easily. My body moved before my mind had even processed what had happened. No office to go to, no emails waiting. But still, I dressed the same. Coffee, notebook, routine. Except this time, my calendar was empty, on purpose. I opened my laptop, not to browse or to distract myself, but to begin. Not with revenge, with review. Every decision I had witnessed over the past 18 months was still fresh. Every warning I'd offered saw ignored. Every shortcut Claire's new team took and documented. They didn't think I noticed, but I did. And now, I had time to prove it mattered. First, I contacted Alan Reyes, a quiet legal advisor I had worked with once during a complicated subcontract dispute. He wasn't flashy, just thorough. I told him I wasn't filing anything yet, just wanted someone I could trust to look at a few documents. Strictly confidential. I'm not looking for a fight, I told him. He replied, good, quiet men usually win bigger. Over the next 2 days I sent him files, scanned pages from the vendor switch Claire rushed through, memos with missing signatures, emails that showed timeline manipulations. He called me back the following evening. Richard, if even half of this went through the board without review, they've got a problem bigger than ego. That's when I started to build a case, not for court, but for leverage. I wasn't going back, but they'd know I had never left without knowing what they were walking into. Next, I reviewed the 3 largest contracts I'd ever negotiated, the ones I had folded into the company's foundation like steel bars inside concrete. I knew each one had clauses connecting continuity to my name, not my title. I'd made sure of it years ago when Martin once joked, if they ever fire you, we're screwed. They hadn't fired me back then, but now someone else had, and the structure was already cracking. One of those clients, a man named Raymond, had written me a personal letter when we first signed the deal. I still had it. He'd said, as long as you're involved, we know this will stay honest. I called him, not as a whistleblower, as a friend. I just wanted to say thank you for the years we worked together. I've stepped away. There was a pause. You stepped away or you were pushed? I didn't answer. I didn't need to. He exhaled sharply. Well, that explains the mess of the last proposal we got. I let that hang in the air. Then, gently, I added, just make sure. Your team reviews the compliance section of the current agreement. Lines 3.6 and 4.1. That was all I said. He understood. By the end of that week, Claire's team had received 2 requests for contract clarification from legacy clients. She wouldn't know it was me. She'd just feel it. Because strategy isn't always about taking action. Sometimes it's about creating motion without moving. Alan and I met once in person. He wore the same faded blazer he always did, laid out the folders on his desk like chess pieces. I've seen companies fold slower with less, he said. I asked him one thing. Is there a way to protect the employees who don't deserve to sync with her? He nodded. You have leverage. Use it to protect what matters. So I did. I drafted a proposal, not for reinstatement, but for structural review. I included recommendations, warnings, exit strategies. I packaged it not as a threat, but as insurance. Then I sent it not to Claire, but to 2 board members I trusted. No return address, no signature, just the facts. Let them draw the line between my absence and their anxiety, because by then, the real silence had begun, and I was no longer part of the system. I was the system's ghost. 3 days after my silent exit, I received a text from an unknown number. You available to talk? No name, no context, but I recognized the tone. Cautious, uncertain. I waited 5 minutes, then replied, who's asking? The typing bubbles flickered, then stopped. 2 hours later, my phone rang. The number was local. I let it go to voicemail. It was Claire. She sounded smaller, not scared, but shaken. Richard, I think there's been some misunderstanding with the Robertson file. They're saying your name was supposed to be on the compliance section. Could you call me? I didn't. Instead, I turned to the flash drive I'd labeled Core. Inside were archived communications, cost projections, employee performance, evaluations, client satisfaction scores. Everything Claire had waved away as old school. I wasn't hoarding data. I was documenting decay. Then came the email from HR, forwarded to me by an anonymous former colleague. It was a termination protocol Claire had initiated 2 weeks before I was dismissed. My name was on it, along with a short list of other senior staff she had marked as culturally incompatible. No performance review, no financial audit, just incompatible. They hadn't just replaced me. They had mapped out an erasure. That's when the shift happened, not just in my planning, but in my posture. This wasn't about ego anymore. This was structural negligence. Claire wasn't just arrogant. She was gambling with reputations, contracts, and legal boundaries she didn't understand, and she thought she could clean up afterward with a few carefully worded apologies. But I wasn't the janitor anymore. I reached out to Julia Adams, a compliance auditor I had worked with during a merger years ago. We'd kept in touch sporadically, and I knew she had moved into private investigations tied to corporate mismanagement. I didn't give her names. I gave her behavior patterns, misreporting, backdated approvals, contractual breaches. She said, "You're describing systemic breakdown." I said, "I'm describing someone who never learned how the scaffolding was held together." Julia agreed to open a quiet inquiry, no alarms, just questions, data, cross-referencing signatures, timestamps, document versions. What she found in 48 hours stunned even me. Multiple vendor approvals signed under the name of a manager who had already resigned. Budget reallocations that violated board policy. Client communications with language that, if challenged, could be considered misrepresentation. It wasn't just carelessness. It was recklessness, and Claire had built her empire on it. The final call I made was to Daniel, Martin's old friend and one of the original silent investors. He was retired now, living in Maine, but still held voting power on the board. Kept it simple. "I'm not trying to bring anyone down," I told him, "but if the structure fails, I want you to know it wasn't without warning." He paused, then said, "Martin once told me you were the compass. Not flashy, but true." That evening I looked at the sticky note I'd folded weeks earlier. The 3 client names, I added a 4th, mine, because I wasn't just trying to protect what we'd built. I was making sure my name, my legacy, wasn't dragged down by someone who thought loyalty was optional. Then I wrote one line in my notebook. I wasn't angry. I was ready, and for the first time in weeks I slept without setting an alarm, because strategy doesn't need noise. It just needs time and patience to let the pieces fall exactly where they should. It started with a ripple, a quiet note, sent from the compliance office to the board. Urgent review requested on recent vendor contracts. Discrepancies noted. I wasn't copied on it, but I didn't need to be. 2 of the 3 clients on my sticky note had already suspended upcoming payments, citing reviewal concerns. The 3rd had demanded a renegotiation, this time excluding any middle managers Claire had brought in. Watched the company from the outside now, like a man studying the house he once built from a ridge across the valley. And from this distance I could see what no one inside could, the cracks widening. Claire called again, voicemail. "I don't know what's happening, but things are spiraling. Can we meet?" We didn't. She didn't know that by then. Julia had compiled a 37-page document highlighting every procedural and financial deviation tied to her team. No accusations, just proof. And the final section, a comparative chart showing company stability during R. Holden's oversight versus post-transition era. The numbers weren't dramatic and they were decisive. I never asked Julia to send it to the board, but she did. 2 days later, Claire was asked to step aside, temporarily. It wasn't public, it wasn't loud, but it was enough, and it wasn't. Over, the true damage lay in what she had tried to hide, a signed contract with a logistics partner whose CEO had served prison time for procurement fraud. She hadn't known, or hadn't cared, but the document bore her signature. The deal had gone through 3 weeks before my dismissal. Buried in it was a clause promising a delivery volume our facilities couldn't support without violating environmental codes. Codes I had personally helped build safeguards around, and now they were exposed. The board called an emergency audit. Claire wasn't invited. I got a text that night from Daniel. "We should have listened earlier, it's worse than you said." I replied with just one word. Expected. The final piece was already in motion. One of the employees Claire had marked as culturally incompatible was a systems analyst named Mira. Brilliant, overlooked, silenced. She'd reached out to me days earlier, Said she'd been forced to backdate IT security logs to match Claire's timelines. I asked if she had copies. She did. With her permission, Julia included those in a second report, one sent directly to legal counsel. What happened next didn't make headlines, but it shook the walls. An internal memo confirmed Claire's administrative leave. Another one announced a structural realignment initiative, the kind of language companies use when they're too embarrassed to say, "We handed the reins to the wrong person." No police, no press, but the silence around the building had weight. Didn't gloat. I didn't post. I went to the same diner I'd visited every Friday for 20 years, ordered black coffee and the usual. The waitress, new, didn't know me, asked if I worked around here. I just smiled and said, "Not anymore." But I remember how things used to be, and for the first time the bitterness was gone, because justice doesn't always come with sirens. Sometimes it arrives in the form of a spreadsheet and a locked office door. I never saw the fallout firsthand. Didn't need to. The calls stopped, the updates faded, and Claire's name, once printed at the top of every company memo, began disappearing from footers and directories like dust wiped from glass. What came instead were the letters. One from a client I hadn't spoken to in over a year. "You were the only reason we stayed. We're moving our contract elsewhere, and not in anger, but out of respect." Another from an employee I'd trained years ago. "I stayed quiet too long, but watching how you handled it, that changed something." And then, 3 days after, the audit began, my phone rang. Recognizable number. I answered it without saying a word. For a few seconds I heard only the sound of uneven breathing. Then her voice, trembling, cracked. "Richard, I didn't know, I swear I didn't." "They're freezing contracts. The board won't talk to me. I need help. Please." She was crying. Not out of panic, but out of realization. The kind that sinks into your bones when denial finally runs out of room. She continued, choked and desperate. "Please, I was wrong. I don't know how to fix this." I didn't respond right away. Silence did what words couldn't, and then I said, calm and clear, "I told you everything you needed to know. You chose not to listen." She tried to speak again, but the weight of her own undoing cut the call short. I didn't call back, because in that moment there was no satisfaction. Only the echo of what she had broken, trying to prove she never needed me. Days later, a letter appeared in my mailbox. No envelope, just folded paper, delivered by someone who didn't ring the bell. It was from Claire. "I didn't understand what I was undoing," she wrote. "You didn't fight me, and maybe that's what made it worse. You just let me break it, and now I see what I really broke." She didn't ask for forgiveness. She just said thank you for not humiliating her, for leaving behind evidence, not wreckage. I folded the letter once and placed it inside the old leather folder Martin had once given me, the one with the company's first blueprint. Its first heartbeat. That chapter was over, but my silence wasn't about closure. It was about clarity. I had once spent my energy holding up a system I didn't own. Now I was free to build something that couldn't be taken from me. I registered. My own firm, small, quiet, just me and a few hand-picked contracts. People I trusted. People who remembered. No advertising, no launch party, just work that spoke for itself. I bought a small cabin 2 hours outside the city. Nothing grand. Wood beams, a lake nearby. Enough space for me and for Max. Max was the oldest dog in the shelter, scar on one eye, limp in his back leg. Everyone passed him by, I didn't. He didn't bark when I opened the gate. Just looked at me, steady, patient, like he already knew who I was. That first night at the cabin, I sat by the fireplace, Max asleep at my feet, and I opened my notebook one last time, wrote a single line. They erased me from the story they were telling, so I wrote a better one. No one cheered, no applause, no revenge, just the quiet strength of someone who rebuilt, not because he had to, but because he could. I never saw the fallout firsthand. I didn't need to. The calls stopped, the updates faded, and Claire's name, once printed at the top of every company memo, began disappearing from footers and directories like dust wiped from glass. What came? Instead were the letters. One from a client I hadn't spoken to in over a year. "You were the only reason we stayed. We're moving our contract elsewhere, not in anger but out of respect." Another from an employee I'd trained years ago. "I stayed quiet too long, but watching how you handled it, that changed something." And then, 3 days after, the audit began. My phone rang. Recognizable number, I answered, without saying a word. For a few seconds I heard only the sound of uneven breathing. Then her voice, a trembling, cracked. "Richard, I didn't know, I swear I didn't. They're freezing contracts, the board won't talk to me. I need help, please." She was crying, not out of panic but out of realization. "The kind that sinks into your bones when denial finally runs out of room," she continued, choked and desperate. "Please, I was wrong. I don't know how to fix this." I didn't respond right away. Silence did what words couldn't, and then I said, calm and clear, "I told you everything you needed to know. You chose not to listen." She tried to speak again, but the weight of her own undoing cut the call short. I didn't call back, because in that moment there was no satisfaction, only the echo of what she had broken, trying to prove she never needed me. Days later, a letter appeared in my mailbox. No envelope, just folded paper delivered by someone who didn't ring the bell. It was from Claire. "I didn't understand what I was undoing," she wrote. "You didn't fight me, and maybe that's what made it worse. You just let me break it, and now I see what I really broke." She didn't ask for forgiveness. She just said thank you for not humiliating her, for leaving behind evidence, not wreckage. I folded the letter once and placed it inside the old leather folder Martin had once given me, the one with the company's first blueprint, its first heartbeat. That chapter was over, but my silence wasn't about closure, it was about clarity. I had once spent my energy holding up a system I didn't own. Now, I was free to build something that couldn't be taken from me. I registered my own firm, small, quiet, just me and a few hand-picked contracts. People I trusted, people who remembered. No advertising, no launch party, just work that spoke for itself. I bought a small cabin 2 hours outside the city. Nothing grand, wood beams, a lake nearby, enough space for me and for Max. Max was the oldest dog in the shelter, scar on one eye, limp in his back leg. Everyone passed him by, I didn't. He didn't bark when I opened the gate, just looked at me, steady, patient, like he already knew who I was. That first night at the cabin, I sat by the fireplace, Max asleep at my feet, and I opened my notebook one last time, wrote a single line. They erased me from the story they were telling, so I wrote a better one. No one cheered, no applause, no revenge, just the quiet strength of someone who rebuilt, not because he had to, but because he could.